Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton. And this week, our topic is not going to be a math topic. It is going.
Yeah, I thought it was going to be geometry. Triangulation. Let's talk about geometry.
We are not going to talk about geometry. We are going to talk about mental health and that it relates to triangles. So our topic is caught in the middle. And so we're going to talk about what happens when you do get caught in the middle, but I think we're going to focus primarily, at least at first, on staying out of the middle.
Right.
Because so as I was thinking about this topic, it reminded me of when I was in elementary school and I had a weird drive and passion. Like I enjoyed getting caught in the middle of two people. Does that sound really bizarre to you?
No, but see, if you look at, I realize I'm asking you to go back to elementary school and think about, what do you think you got? Because it's going to be very similar for adults. It's not going to be that different. In elementary school, what do you think you got, Bean?
It was a sense of belonging.
Right. That is certainly true. A sense of belonging. What else? There's probably some other thing.
Probably. Let's see. We're psychoanalyzing elementary school Liz here. How fun.
Well, no, but when you say caught in the middle, like solving problems between two of your classmates?
Yeah. Or just this idea that two people are fighting and I'm in the middle trying to mediate it, right? Or maybe, or it could be, if two people are fighting and somebody tries to pull me to their side, again, it's that sense of belonging.
Right. And you feel important. At least to the person who's pulling you. I mean, it feels good to help people resolve conflict.
That too.
Right?
Yep.
I mean, that's not a bad thing to help people resolve conflict. So I think the things you got in elementary school are very similar to what drives people's behavior as adults when they get caught in a triangle.
Yeah, it's true. And I will admit that there are times where being in the middle is unavoidable. I mean, especially if you are, the biggest example I can think of is if you are in management. Then you have to help two employees resolve conflict. You are caught in the middle and that's unavoidable. But, I think that's probably a little bit different than what we're talking about here. But
well, can I counter that just a little bit? And I don't know that I think I agree with you. But let's say you're a parent and you are caught in the middle of two of your kids.
Yeah.
Let's make it even a little bit harder. They're either late adolescent or adults.
Okay.
Then how does that feel to you? Do you think that's helpful?
Ooh, I mean, I can see myself doing that just because, I mean, I've been caught in the middle of my parents for a number of years now.
But okay. I mean, I think this is good. Are you okay talking about it? Because
I'm very open about this. Yeah.
Does that feel healthy to you for all three of you?
Yes.
Oh, it does.
It does. Yes.
Okay.
So I have been saying, I've told people I've played marriage counselor between my parents for a number of years. And here's why I think that it feels healthy for all three of us now. And I'm very clear with them about this. I will always defend one to the other. I can be unbiased because I love my parents. I love them equally, and I have a good, strong relationship with them. And it's not like this happens all the time, right? But if one of my parents comes to me and they want to vent about something, I will always defend the one to the other. So if I'm talking to dad, I defend mom. And if I'm talking to mom, I defend dad. And they know that. And so they're probably pretty limited on what they do come to me about. And I'm talking about, past issues where there's been something more serious going on. And I feel like it has been helpful in the past and just, I don't know, I in helping them to see the other person's point of view.
So let me throw out a question then. Do you think in any way you might be enabling them to not learn those skills themselves?
Oh, probably. Yeah,
Okay.
I think that is a distinct possibility. And
Just from I don't know if you'd call it a theoretical perspective, wouldn't it be healthier if they could handle the discussion between themselves?
oh yes, it would be.
Okay. I'm not saying they can. I mean, you're
Yeah.
probably thinking,
Yeah.
okay, there's no way, your parents can do that. But, I'm trying to generalize it more because I'm
Hmm.
sure some of our listeners are in very similar situations, where they're caught between their parents. But I think one thing that our listeners ought to think about is by being in the middle and being the mediator.
Hmm.
And even though I hear you clearly saying, like a therapist, you try and stay
Hmm.
right in the middle
Hmm.
and in between. I think in some ways that prevents them possibly from learning those skills. Because if you think about it let's talk about it from a therapeutic perspective. You bring up really good points
Hmm.
because in therapy,
Hmm.
so this is what I do every day
Hmm.
is I'll have couples and they will try and pull me in to triangulate,
Yep.
to side with one of them. And
Yeah.
in fact, often the reason they bring whatever the issue is up in the therapy room is for me to say, I mean, I know what one of them is thinking, aren't I right?
Yep.
And the therapist is going to say, yeah, you're right.
Hmm.
When really what I want to do is teach them the skills to resolve it themselves,
Good point.
is
Yeah.
my ultimate goal. My ultimate goal is for the couple not to come back to see me, but only because they've gained the skills to do it themselves.
That's a good point. And there are times, many, many times, where I have said to my parents, you guys have got to talk about this yourselves. And it's not like this is an ongoing all the time thing. I guess
Right.
but there have been instances where my parents have had struggles in
Hmm.
their marriage in the past, and they've needed people to talk to.
Yeah.
They needed someone to talk to about it, and I've been a good person for them to discuss it with.
Well, I want to be clear. I'm not saying you
Yeah.
shouldn't have done that.
Yeah.
It's just that by you bringing up the example, I think it's a really good, it's
Point.
a
Yeah.
segue into talking about can this be harmful sometimes? Harmful
Yeah.
is too strong of a word, I think,
Yeah.
because like the way you're describing it, I don't know that I would call it harmful, except maybe they aren't learning skills that,
Yeah.
maybe they could.
Uh,
I don't know that I'd call that harmful, but
But I agree with what you're saying. And I also think that's important to differentiate the difference between you're just venting because this is irritating. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a good thing. I personally make it a point never to vent about Curtis to my family,
hmm.
right? But I want to distinguish the difference between I'm just venting and I have a problem that I need to solve, because I think that is different, right? And so,
I agree with you. Because I think you can take this example and think, okay, if you're caught between two parents, or maybe you're caught between two of your adult kids,
mhm,
and you take one side over the other,
yeah,
then I think you eventually harm the relationship
I
with at least
agree.
that one child. So that's where it could be harmful. But what I hear you clearly saying is you never do that with your
Mhm.
parents, and so I wouldn't call it harmful, but may not be best for them.
Right.
But
And
also, you know them pretty well.
yeah,
And again, I want to generalize this. There are some people who maybe would not be able to learn those skills for whatever
right.
reason.
Yeah, it can be a hard skill for people to learn. And you also got to remember that I've had years of practice and years of trying to look
Right.
at things from both sides. And that's really what it comes down to. And that's something that I prize in myself a lot, is that I have the ability to look at things from somebody else's perspective. I'm not
Hmm.
perfect at it, but it's something I work very hard to do, is try to see things from the other person's point of view.
Yeah.
And, if you do happen to get caught in a triangle, and again, sometimes it's unavoidable, but if you are caught between two people, I think that is a critical skill to learn, is trying to see the other person's point of view, right? I think that can
Right.
be a critical skill. So I have a funny story. When I talked about this in a class that I was taking, the professor, he was teaching a lesson on this, and he gave this funny example that I think you'll appreciate. So he was talking to one of his parents. I think he was talking to his mom, and she was venting about her dad or saying something. And he said, "Hey, Mom, can you put Dad on the phone? And so they're both on the line. So they're all three having a conversation at once. And he goes, Hey, Dad, Mom just said this about you, and then hung up the phone.
Oh my God.
That
Well,
is what
okay. Maybe it forces them to talk about it, but so your professor, was that his experience or was he just relating someone
he
that
was relating the experience.
because I'm curious what happened after that.
I don't know. He was
Well,
just saying he was just saying it was one way to get out of a triangle. That's one
well,
way,
which is
and it
true,
is.
which is true, which is true, but I'd really want to know, okay, what happened after that? Um,
Oh,
that would be interesting. One of the things we should talk about is what's the reason people try to create triangles?
mm,
You
it
know, so
yeah, it creates stability, and it's not necessarily healthy, but it creates stability. So the reason
tell me how it creates stability. I'm curious.
so if you have, or at least it creates stability for the people in conflict, or at least for one of the people in conflict. Maybe that's it, is it creates stability for them because they're able to pull somebody to their side. And
What about power? Calling it power, it might create power for them.
mm,
I think one of the reasons that we created is, you're having an argument and you say, "Hey, what do you think?" I mean, I'm trying to pull this other person in to support my position, right?
yeah,
So, I guess you could call it stability. I think it creates power.
that's another important point to make is that the differences, or when there's a power differential, when you get
Right,
pulled into these triangles,
right,
and there's different ways that can happen. Maybe you have two kids are in conflict, right, and they have an equal power footing, but then they try
right,
to pull mom or dad in, right?
right.
So they're trying, again, it's that they're trying to pull that power in and that authority in onto their side. And one of the examples that was brought up in my religion class is where this can be really unhealthy for couples, because oftentimes couples will try to pull, because we did an entire section on, and I realize this is religious, but this is just a good example of therapy and marriage in religious couples and the
Hmm.
importance of therapists understanding this dynamics. Because sometimes what couples will do is, if a couple is in conflict, they'll say, well, I've prayed about this and I've got God on my side on this.
Right, right.
And
So what they've done is they've triangulated God
yes.
into the relationship. That is really interesting. I think that's a good point to bring up.
Hmm.
Really interesting.
Yeah, and so the whole point of this entire article that we read was, how do you help couples in this instance? Because this couple genuinely believes that they're right, and they genuinely believe that they've got God on their side. And so, it's this idea that you have to step back and look at this from this other person's point of view. And I think that's
Right.
really the best way to dissipate a triangle and to dissipate any conflict, is to, one, take responsibility, and two, see it from the other person's point of view. If you can do that, it will immediately bring the temperature down on any conflict, which is
Right.
how a triangle results is conflict.
And so if we go back to, like you mentioned earlier,
Hmm.
in say a work setting, and
Hmm.
you have a supervisor and you have two workers, and could that be considered a triangle if the supervisor has to get in between the two workers? Here's what I think the difference is. In a family setting,
Hmm.
it's really all about relationship, at least from
Mm.
my perspective. That what can happen in a triangle, the reason they can be destructive is they can really destroy relationships, or
Yeah.
they can be harmful to relationships,
Right, right.
which I think is more important in the family setting. But say you have the work setting, then clearly there is this power dynamic
Hmm.
that's different, but also the relationship is different. And if you, as the supervisor, side with one worker over the other, that doesn't have the same ramifications for relationships. I mean, it might damage as a supervisor, your relationship with that one worker, but
Yeah.
still, it's not the same as being in the family. And sometimes you have to do that, especially if, as a supervisor, you're making a choice that's, say, for the best thing for the business, or, for say the group as a whole.
Hmm.
Whereas in a family, that I think that's very different. Although there may be a case as a parent where you do have to step in. I mean, I can, for something as let's say as the, oh, this is going to sound patriarchal, but, parents as the head of the family. I mean, someone's, especially if you're dealing with adolescents, I mean, you're kind of in charge of the family. I mean, you have,
Sure. Well, and
and
let's point out the difference between intervening with your young children versus
right, that's
your
very
adult.
different. I mean,
Because
that's your job. That is your job, I think,
yeah,
to do that.
yeah. Well, because that's one thing that Curtis and I tend to disagree about a little bit in terms of parenting style is when do we intervene? Because I'm all about letting them figure it out themselves.
Which
To an
is true.
extent, yeah. I mean,
I think you do need to do that. So it's like it's almost like a balancing act.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
How far do you let him go?
yeah.
And then, if the brother or somebody starts beating up on the other kid, then,
Okay,
you may
it's
have
gone far enough.
you may have to intervene. But I agree with your philosophy
Yeah.
that, you need to let kids try and figure it out a lot of the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, let them learn to resolve their conflict themselves. Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite things is
Look at the parallel between you and your parents, though. you I mean, on some level, you could really say, well, mom and dad, you really need to learn how to resolve your conflict on your own. Anyway, I just thought I'd point that out. That what we're
but
talking about, the best thing for your children might indeed be the best thing for your parents.
and I should point out too that my parent every situation is unique, and my parents have got some underlying complications in their relationship.
Right, and
You know,
I agree with that. That
yeah.
every situation is different. I agree with that.
Yeah, and so I don't want people to walk away with this idea that, my parents are like these
No,
incapable adults
no,
because they're not, right? I mean,
no.
And some marriages are just you can have extenuating circumstances where it's tough and you do need outside help. And it takes a village and sometimes I think when you do have this really something really big going on in a family, I think sometimes it's unavoidable for people to, get caught in the middle a little bit, right?
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
and a lot of times with my parents it was they needed somebody to talk to about what was going on and they needed someone to listen to them.
Hmm.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? I mean, because,
Right. I agree. It's not a bad thing. That's why
and
I'm agreeing with you. I'm not saying
yeah,
that what you're doing with your parents is
right.
harmful. I'm just using it
Yeah,
as a, more generalizing for our listeners, because I'm sure some of our listeners are caught in between their parents as well.
sure, sure. But this brings up another good point with families and in terms of, conflict within a family, because conflict is inevitable in a family. Like there's
Right.
going to happen. And so, if you do find yourself, as we've kind of called it, caught in the middle
Hmm.
of this conflict, I think that sometimes you need a listening ear. So I'm thinking of if you've got a couple going through a divorce, right?
Hmm.
That's a really big, messy, sticky situation. And especially if there are kids involved, like there's a lot of emotions and a lot of attachments going on here. And, I think that it's okay to be a listening ear for someone and it's okay to validate. But, I think you can set boundaries. I think you can set healthy boundaries. So, for example, let's say that you have a kid who's going through divorce and you have a good relationship with your daughter-in-law and your son,
Hmm.
right? So you have a good relationship
Hmm.
with both. They have kids together. You care about these kids and you care about your soon to be ex daughter-in-law. You still care about her. Now, I think it's okay for you to listen to your son as he needs to vent and get things off his chest, but you can set a healthy boundary by saying, I understand this is a frustrating situation, but I want you to remember that I love my daughter-in-law and I love my grandkids and I need you to be respectful of them. I'm okay
Right.
listening, I'm okay letting you vent, but set that healthy boundary. And I think that's a good thing to do in any family conflict. It can be the same thing with siblings. Maybe you're caught in between two siblings. You can say, I'm okay listening to you and I'm okay venting, but I just want you to remember I still love my other sibling that you're fighting with and I
Hmm.
still care about them. So I can listen to this conflict and I can be sympathetic, but I need you to be respectful.
Right. And so I actually had this situation. I don't
Hmm.
know that our listeners, no, I don't know that I've talked about it, but my oldest daughter is divorced. And
Hmm.
so before the divorce, they they were working through it for a couple of years in separation. And I met on a fairly regular basis with my now ex son-in-law. And we
Hmm.
talked about relationship. I never thought of it as triangulation because I mean, in the end, I was always really about supporting my daughter.
Yeah.
But in that context, we were talking about relationships in general and, of that nature. And so I was listening a lot.
Hmm.
So it worked out. I mean, and it didn't work out with their marriage, but I think as we're talking about divorce, one of the things that happens, and kids, adolescents, or even children are
Hmm.
often caught, and there's no power, and parents will try and create another word we haven't used is coalition, and often
Mm-hmm.
triangles can be seen as trying to create a coalition. And so I've seen it many times where divorced parents will try and pull their kids to their side. And that is so destructive for everybody, not necessarily well, I mean, the parents are already struggling, but that is really destructive for
Yeah.
children to be
Yeah.
triangulated in any type of divorce situation. Really, really
Hmm.
hard. I think that one of the things we had to talk about too, we've talked about how easy it is, say, in families to get pulled into those triangles. I think there are some mental health issues where it can be more common. Certainly, borderline personality disorder is pretty common for people to try and create a coalition or the
Hmm.
triangle. But I think in a lot of ways, and I think a lot of behaviors for like narcissists will do it as well.
Hmm.
I think that often that it's an unconscious move to create power
Yeah.
and to create some chaos. I think often triangles can create chaos as well. So, how you mentioned earlier, and I really believe this, that in the case of your parents, it stabilizes the
Mm-hmm.
relationship in some way.
Hmm.
I think in a lot, but that's because you're neutral. You're maintaining a neutral position. In a lot of cases in relationships, the triangulation can destabilize the relationship, and that might be even the intent because you're creating this coalition, and so you're destabilizing the relationship. And there's some mental health issues where that happens
Yeah.
more often. Doesn't happen all the time. Narcissist, borderline personality, if you're in a toxic friendship or toxic relationship, that can
Hmm.
happen. So it's
Hmm.
just be aware of that. I think early on in this episode, you talked about, I think you mentioned just don't get pulled into the triangle. How
Yeah.
do you think you do that?
So the best way is just to say, well, probably
Like
depend.
your example,
Yeah.
just hang up the phone.
Uh-huh. That's one way.
Here's what mom just said about you. Click. Goodbye.
So here's the best way I think to do it. So if somebody's trying to create a coalition triangle with you,
Hmm.
you just say up front, I'm not really comfortable talking about this person behind their back
That's
like
right.
this,
Yeah.
right? Now, if this is an ongoing conflict, right? And if it's an ongoing conflict and it's a big, like in the case of a divorce, or maybe there's two siblings who are fighting, or if there's something deep, something going on, life happens, and sometimes conflict, you can't help but getting pulled in a little bit to the conflict. Again, I think you just try to remain neutral, and you can be that supportive ear, but the best way to avoid it in the first place is just to don't be a gossip, I guess, is the best
Well,
is the biggest way
it's
to do
that,
it.
but realize that, say you're in a friendship or
Hmm.
even say within siblings and you're adults, you need to be able to say, you two need to work this out.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get involved. This is your problem. This is not my problem.
Hmm.
And the problem is, early on in the episode, we talked about what do you get out of it when you talked about your experience in elementary school.
Hmm.
And so I think it's hard because if you're being pulled into a triangle or a coalition, you feel needed, you feel wanted, you feel important,
Yeah.
you feel like I can help these two people solve this problem. I love my siblings, so I'm going to help them solve the problem. But in reality, often it destabilizes the relationship, and one of them is going to be angry at you. So
Yeah.
you have to think of it in terms of you want to preserve the relationship between, let's say, siblings, both my siblings. I
Hmm.
really need to stay out of it
Yeah.
and
And
let,
it
and let them solve it, even though it might feel good in the moment
yeah.
for them to come to you and say, we want your help, or that feels good. I'm important and I'm needed and I'm wanted. That doesn't mean you do it.
And it's okay to say, and if you do have an ongoing conflict, it's okay to say, I appreciate that you're struggling with this. I'd really rather
Right,
not get in the middle. And
right.
that's okay to do too. Looking at this from, my perspective of, I don't know, I mean, it's just my inability to not help somebody that comes to me with a problem. Maybe this is
Well,
my toxic trait is I can't help myself. But,
you just have to understand what is, you have to be able to look ahead and say, well, where would this go? Like if I
yeah,
got in the middle of this,
yeah.
where could it potentially go? Could it go bad?
Mhm. Oh,
Yeah,
it did once.
yeah. Well, it
It
can.
has
I mean,
before. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, but I mean, I think it's okay to do both. I think it's okay to be a listening, supportive ear and
right,
to say, I'm not comfortable being in the middle of this. I would really rather stay out of this. And
right. When you talk about being a comfortable listening ear, I wonder if you're really describing something different than than a typical triangle, the way we're talking about it. Because I
I think
agree with
so.
that. I mean, I
Yeah.
think if you can remain neutral, really going back to therapy and working with
Hmm.
couples, that's my goal is to remain neutral.
Yes. Yeah.
And even though I've certainly had the experience of thinking, oh, that person's right. I mean, in my
Uh-huh.
head, I'm thinking
Uh-huh.
that,
Yeah.
but I'm thinking, okay, they need to figure this out themselves because my job is not to be the mediator. Even though a lot of people do seek couples counseling to try and find a mediator, but that's not really the job. The job is to help them learn skills so they can do this on their own.
That's a really good point. And maybe that is mediating, right? I mean, because you're still mediating the problem, but your ultimate goal is teaching them the skill. So I guess you start out as a mediator, right? So I think therapy, because, sometimes with couples, I think it is very helpful for couples to be able to get it out in a controlled environment.
To talk about it though, and to
Yeah.
be heard,
Yes.
which I don't consider that being a mediator. See, I
Okay.
still, we've talked many times about the importance of listening and understanding and the validation and the empathy. And so if a couple comes in, I mean, the vast majority of the time they talk about a problem. I say, okay, let's use this problem
Hmm.
to learn new skills.
Okay.
Really often, that's the best way actually to teach them is let's take a current problem that you each
Hmm.
have a different view on. This happens most of the time. It doesn't happen all the time, but most of the time. If you can really get them to slow down and listen to the other person and really see it from the other person's perspective,
Hmm.
what happens is they're so much better able to come up with a compromise or come up with a solution. Because I really think that a lot of the conflict is about not feeling heard,
Yeah. Or
which
it's,
I think is probably what you're doing for your parents often is you're giving them the sense that they're being heard
yeah.
and that you understand each of them. Because the way you describe it is you're being able to validate and understand each of their positions.
And I have told my parents many times that they need some serious work on their communication skills with each other. I mean,
Yeah.
I have often said I feel like my parents are like two different species that are
Hmm.
somehow been married for 30 years. But again, bringing this back to a more general sense of, yeah, a lot of times conflict is about power
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
a need for a redistribution of the power, right? Because there's either something is going on where you feel like the power is uneven or where it shouldn't be, right? Where at work and you're in conflict with a supervisor.
Hmm.
If that conflict, I mean that's a lot harder because again there's that power differential. But
Right.
if you're in conflict with someone who is an equal with you, then again, it's usually about the need for a redistribution of power, right? I mean, things feel unequal. I don't feel heard. I don't feel like you're doing this, or I feel like I'm doing too much. And so, that's what the conflict is generally about. And so it's how do we navigate this? How do we solve this? How do we redistribute this power so that we both can walk away happy?
Right. And I think it always comes down to having a better dialogue,
Yeah. Hmm.
and with that understand that we've talked about so many times is
Yeah.
that validation and the empathy. And remember, validation does not mean you agree. It just means
Yep.
I get it from the other person's perspective. And that's what a lot of couples are missing. They just want to be right. And so
Hmm.
often the triangle is created as a way to get someone else to say, yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
You
And
know,
it's
it's that coalition.
and it's not about being right. It's about being heard.
Relationships aren't about being right. I try and help
Yeah.
people figure that
Hmm.
out every single day. It is about being heard and being understood
Yeah.
and the empathy. It's not about being right. It's Harville Hendricks who
Hmm.
said, you can, you'll talk to a couple and you say, okay, make a choice. You can either be right or you can be married. Which one do
Yeah.
you want?
Yeah.
And so, you say, well, I want to be right. Or I want to be married. And so you have to give up being right. It's not about being right.
Yeah. Because
Not about that.
there are times in any conflict where there is no good solution,
Right.
right? I mean that happens a lot. But
Hmm.
I think oftentimes again it's like what you said, it's about being heard. And so if you are caught in this triangle, right? Or if you do happen to find yourself caught between two people, the best thing that you can do to help them is to get them to sit down and
Yeah.
talk about it. Say, okay, I want you guys to discuss
Yeah.
this. Like, pull them in and say, hey, you guys have got this conflict going on. If you are going to insist that I be sucked into the middle, then I'm going to be really sucked into the middle. And we're all going to talk about this because I'm not picking a side. So, I mean, that's another, I guess, way that you could help it. But, in order to get out of this triangle, you have to force them to confront it. And another thing that I think is important to keep in mind in these instances, especially if it's a broader conflict or if it's something like, divorce or there's some major underlying issue, deep rooted issue, you have to understand that sometimes time is needed
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Time is needed just to kind of
You're right.
help, especially in the case
Right.
of divorce. I mean, you cannot take two people who have just decided they're going to get divorced and sit down and expect them to be able to fix all their problems in one day.
Right.
In that instance, they need time, right?
Yeah. So I think as a general rule, though, if you had a general rule, I would say to our listeners, try not to get sucked into the triangle.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Avoid
But,
it.
if you're in the triangle, then I think that what you said is true. You've got to get the people to talk. In a lot of ways, see if you could, I'm here holding up my hands, which our listeners can't see. But the classic triangle is it goes from one person through the middle to the other person, and you're acting as a conduit almost. And that's
Hmm.
really unhealthy. But what you're doing, you're if you get the two people who are having the conflict to talk together, then in some ways that's a healthier way to approach it.
It stabilizes.
Yeah.
It does,
Yeah.
then it does stabilize, I mean,
Right.
because yeah, if you have that, if you're just that conduit between two people, well, there's nothing to support that structure. Eventually, this triangle is flipped on its point like a pyramid and it's likely to
Yeah.
topple. But if you can flip it and get that bottom piece connected,
Right. There you go.
then
That's
it,
a good visual image. I like that.
yeah, then you can
Yeah.
stabilize it and
Right.
then, you know, resolve or dissolve the triangle. So, you know, uh, triangles, it's exhausting. It may feel good
Yeah.
at first, but and
Yeah.
again, that feeling of, oh, I'm needed and I'm wanted and they care about me, they care enough about my opinion that they're coming to me.
Yeah.
Those
Yeah.
feelings may feel good, but eventually it is going to wear you down.
That's right.
So, takeaway. What's your big takeaway? I
The
guess
takeaway is try not to
yeah, we already
try
did
not.
the
Well,
takeaway.
okay. Here's the takeaway. I really liked what you did with the visual image of the triangle. An unhealthy triangle is you're at the bottom on the tip, and it's on it. And you have the two people on the
Hmm.
edges, and it's really unstable. But if you get them talking, the two
Yeah.
people in conflict, it essentially flips the triangle over so that it's laying on the flat edge and it becomes more stable. I like that. I
Yeah.
like that way of thinking about it.
Hmm. So that's what to do if you do get sucked into a triangle. And it does happen, and there are healthy
Yeah,
ways to go about it, but you have to set the boundary from the
right.
get-go that you are going to be neutral.
Yep.
Okay. So next week, we are going to turn back to marriages. We're going to talk about consumer marriages.
So what do
So,
you mean by consumer marriage? Do you have a brief definition of that?
yes. So, treating marriage like you do consumer goods. If you get sick of it, you can just replace it with the newest and
Oh,
latest model.
okay. Good
Why?
thing to talk about then.
Yes. So, I guess it's probably going to really come down to keeping your relationship strong and healthy and ways to do that. But we're going to talk about the main problems with treating your marriage that way of I can just upgrade for the newest model. It's a problem.
Right. Okay.
All right. We will see you all next week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.